Sometimes life puts you in situations where you're forced to choose between your own peace of mind and the guilt your own family tries to load onto your shoulders. And in that moment, you either cave in or you stand firm, even if it means being labeled as selfish. That's exactly what happened to me. And it all began the day I heard my mom screaming in my living room, "Where do we sleep?" As if I had suddenly turned into the villain of some family drama. Let me rewind and explain how everything reached that boiling point. I had worked for years, literal years of sweat, sacrifices, and late nights to finally save enough to buy a house of my own. It wasn't huge, it wasn't some fancy mansion, but it was mine. And to me it was a symbol of independence and security, something I had never truly felt growing up in a house where my brother and his needs always overshadowed mine. When I finally got the keys, I promised myself that this would be my safe place, my sanctuary, a home where I could breathe freely without the chaos and drama that seemed to follow my family around like a shadow. For a few months, that's exactly what it was: quiet evenings, my own routines, no one barging in unannounced, and a sense of pride every time I walked through the door. But that peace didn't last long, because one evening, I got a call from my mother that completely threw me off guard. She said, in her usual dramatic tone, that my brother and his wife were going through a rough patch and needed temporary accommodation. Now, if you knew my brother, you'd know that the words temporary and rough patch never meant what they sounded like. Temporary usually turned into permanent, and a rough patch for him often meant he had made bad decisions again, either financially, emotionally, or just plain irresponsibly, and someone else was expected to clean up his mess. I was hesitant right away, but before I could even think of how to respond, my mom continued, "You have a house now, don't you? It's only fair that you help your brother's family. They have kids, you don't. They need space more than you do." That last sentence hit me hard, because it carried the weight of all those years where my needs were always seen as less important than his. But still, I stayed quiet on the phone, not giving her an answer, because part of me was afraid of saying no directly. A few days later, without my consent, without even asking me again, my brother's SUV pulled up in front of my driveway, loaded with bags, boxes, toys, and a cranky toddler crying in the backseat. His wife was already shouting at him about how late they were, and my mom, who had apparently orchestrated this, came out of the car holding a grocery bag, as if they were all just moving into a vacation home. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, with anger and disbelief. They were acting like this was already decided, like my house was now just an extension of theirs. My mom hugged me tightly, trying to brush past me, as if she owned the place, muttering, "Don't worry, it's only until they get back on their feet." I remember staring at the pile of luggage, then at my front door, and realizing that my sanctuary was about to be invaded. At first, I tried to swallow my frustration. I told myself maybe it really was temporary, maybe they just needed a few nights until they sorted things out. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be that simple. The first night confirmed it. My brother immediately claimed the master bedroom, saying his kids needed the bigger space. His wife unpacked in my closet, moving my clothes as if they were in her way, and my mom made herself comfortable in the guest room. I found myself pushed into the smaller room at the back, the one I had set up as a study. My own house, and suddenly, I was a guest in it. They made no effort to ask me, no effort to respect boundaries, and no effort to acknowledge that they were intruding. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that maybe it would just be for a week, but that illusion shattered when I overheard my brother on the phone the next morning, telling a friend, "Yeah, we're settled in at my sister's place for now. It'll do until we figure things out. Could be a few months." A few months. My blood ran cold, because that was never the deal. Not that there even was a deal, had never agreed to this in the first place. I remember pacing my own living room that day, staring at the toys scattered across the floor, the dishes piling up in the sink, and the sound of cartoons blasting from the TV that I had never even switched on. This wasn't my home anymore. It felt hijacked. And yet, when I tried to bring it up with my mom, she dismissed me with her classic guilt trip tone. "You're being selfish. They have children, you don't. Think of family. What's more important, your comfort or their survival?" That line played on repeat in my head, because it was exactly how things had always been framed since we were kids. My brother could do no wrong, and I was always the one expected to bend, to adjust, to sacrifice. But now it was different. This was my house, my hard-earned space, and I wasn't willing to watch it slip away just because no one respected my boundaries. And yet, when I finally put my foot down weeks later, telling them they had overstayed and needed to find their own place, that's when the explosion happened, when my mother screamed, "Where do we sleep?" As if I had banished them to the streets, as if my refusal to let them take over my home made me heartless. That moment still rings in my ears, because it wasn't just about a bed or a roof, it was about years of built-up resentment, favoritism, and the never-ending expectation that I should carry the burden of everyone else's choices. And I knew, right then, that saying no wasn't just about protecting my house, it was about finally standing up for myself. After my mother screamed those words, the room fell into a heavy silence, the kind where you can almost hear the air vibrating with tension. My brother froze mid-step, his wife crossed her arms with a smirk that said she had been waiting for this explosion, and the kids, too young to understand, just stared wide-eyed before going back to their toys scattered. On my floor, I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, fighting the urge to either break down crying or slam the front door shut and walk away. My mother's voice wasn't just loud, it was filled with that familiar edge of accusation, like I had committed some crime against my own blood. "Where do we sleep?" she repeated, louder this time, as if I had personally evicted her from her rightful palace, as if my entire existence and hard work were meant only to provide comfort for everyone else. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay calm, though inside I was boiling. I said, as firmly as I could, "This is my home. I worked for it. I didn't sign up to host you forever. You can't just take over and act like it's yours." The words felt heavy leaving my mouth, because never before had I dared to directly confront my family like this. But instead of understanding, instead of acknowledging the truth, they all looked at me like I was some ungrateful stranger, some outsider. My brother stepped forward then, his tone defensive, his chest puffed out as if he was ready to turn this into a war. "What's your problem? We're family. It's not like we're strangers off the street. You think you're better than us just because you bought a house." His words were meant to cut, and for a second, I felt the sting, but I stood my ground. I said, "No, I don't think I'm better than you, but I think I have a right to my own space. I didn't work my whole life just to become your landlord without rent, without respect, without even being asked." His wife chimed in then, rolling her eyes dramatically. "God, you're so dramatic. It's not a big deal. Families live together all the time. You act like sharing your home for a few months is the end of the world." Her casual tone made my blood boil, because this wasn't just about sharing, it was about boundaries, about respect, about the fact that they had moved in without my consent. My mom, meanwhile, sat down on the couch, her hand pressed to her forehead as if she was fainting, playing her classic victim role. "I can't believe my own daughter is treating us like this. We raised you, we gave you everything, and now you can't even give us a roof over our heads when we need it." That guilt-laced monologue was her specialty, and I could feel myself slipping back into the child who always caved, who always gave up her spot, her toy, her dream, just to keep peace in the family. But this time, I clenched my fists and reminded myself, this is different. This is my home. The days following that confrontation were hell. They didn't leave, they stayed. But the atmosphere shifted from fake normalcy to outright hostility. My brother would slam doors louder than necessary. His kids would run wild with no discipline. His wife would accidentally move my belongings or break things. And my mother would sigh every time she saw me, muttering under her breath about how cold-hearted I had become. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around to avoid conflict. But no matter what I did, the conflict found me anyway. One night, I came home from work exhausted, only to find my fridge raided and my groceries gone. When I confronted them, my brother shrugged. "You weren't gonna eat it anyway. We'll replace it." But of course, they never did. My pantry became their pantry. My couch became their playground, and my silence became their green light. To keep taking, every little thing became a battle inside my head. Do I speak up and risk another blowout, or do I swallow it and keep the peace? Slowly, I began to feel like I was suffocating. It wasn't just about space, it was about dignity. Imagine walking into your own living room and finding your brother sprawled on your couch, snoring, with the TV blaring at max volume, while his kids fought over your personal things, and his wife complained about how small the place was. My house, my sanctuary, had turned into a nightmare. I couldn't sleep properly. I couldn't think straight. and my work started to suffer. Colleagues noticed I was distracted. Friends stopped visiting because I was too embarrassed to have anyone over. And I found myself crying in the car after long shifts because I dreaded going home. And through it all, my mom kept pushing, pressing, guilting. "This is what family is for," she'd say. "If we can't lean on each other, then what's the point of family?" And every time she said that, it dug deeper into my heart, because I wanted to believe in family, but what she called leaning felt more like crushing. Weeks turned into months. The temporary stays stretched longer, and with each day, I felt more invisible in my own life. My brother started inviting his friends over, without even asking me, turning my weekends into loud gatherings where I was treated like a background extra. His wife began redecorating, moving furniture around, buying cheap decor, and claiming it was to make the space more livable. I remember walking in one day to see my favorite reading nook, the one I had worked hard to set up, completely dismantled, replaced with a play area for their kids. It broke something inside me. This wasn't compromise. This wasn't family helping each other. This was takeover. And the worst part, they acted like I was the ungrateful one, like I should be thanking them for bringing life into my lonely house. The breaking point came one evening when I returned from work and found my bedroom door locked. At first, I thought maybe I had misplaced my keys, but then I heard voices inside. My brother's wife had moved her stuff into my room, claiming it was more convenient for the kids if she and my brother took the bigger space. I lost it. I pounded on the door until they opened it, and I shouted, my voice trembling with fury, "Get out! Get out of my room! Get out of my house! Enough is enough!" My mother, who had been sitting on the couch, knitting, stood up in shock, her face pale, and screamed those infamous words again, "Where do we sleep?" as though I had just condemned them to live on the streets. But this time, I didn't flinch, I didn't apologize. I stared right back at her and said, "That's not my problem anymore. I've given enough. You need to figure it out." And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders. But of course, nothing is ever that simple with family. Instead of packing up right away, they turned it into a full-blown drama. My mom called relatives, telling them how heartless I was, painting me as the villain who kicked her own mother and brother out. My phone blew up with calls from aunts and cousins, lecturing me about duty, responsibility, and how ashamed I should be. My brother went around telling anyone who would listen that I was selfish, ungrateful, and arrogant. For days, I was bombarded with insults, manipulation, and guilt. But beneath all that noise, I knew one thing. I had finally drawn a line, and even if it made me the villain in their story, I was going to be the hero in my own. The hardest part about standing my ground wasn't just facing my family's anger inside my home. It was the storm outside that came from everyone else they dragged into the situation. Word travels fast in families like mine, where gossip is almost a currency, and soon every relative had an opinion about me. Some called to scold me, others sent long messages dripping with passive-aggressive phrases like, "We all make sacrifices for family," or "One day when you're old, you'll regret treating your mother this way." Even those who had never once helped me, those who had ignored me when I was struggling, suddenly found the courage to tell me I was cruel and selfish. It was as if my decision to protect my space had given them an excuse to project all their judgments onto me. I felt cornered, not just inside my own four walls, but in the wider web of family expectations. Every phone call left me shaking. Every text message felt like a dagger. And yet none of them asked me how I was doing. None of them cared about the sacrifices I had made to even own a home. To them, I was just the selfish daughter, the cold sister, the one who forgot where she came from. What they didn't know or didn't care to know was how much I had given up to build this life. They didn't know about the nights I went hungry to pay rent, the jobs I worked back to back with barely any sleep, the dreams I put on hold so I could save money. They didn't know that while my brother blew money on luxuries, trips, and reckless choices, I was budgeting every penny, clipping coupons, and walking instead of taking the bus just to keep my finances intact. They didn't know that I had fought through loneliness, through breakdowns, through doubt, to finally reach a place where I could turn the key in a door and say, "This is mine." And now, that accomplishment was being rewritten by everyone else as selfishness. My brother's narrative had spread so far that people were saying things like, "How could she let children suffer?" Or "She thinks money is more important than family." None of them stepped back to ask if I had been asked, if I had been given a choice, if maybe I was the one suffering. Inside the house, the hostility only grew worse. My brother, emboldened by the support he was getting from the family, began walking around as though the place truly belonged to him. He would bring home groceries and make it a point to loudly tell my mom, "See, I'm contributing," while leaving the receipts on the counter for me to notice. Of course, those groceries were always things his family ate, things I barely touched. But the performance was for my mother's approval, not mine. His wife started criticizing me openly, mocking the way I decorated, telling relatives on speakerphone how pathetic my lifestyle was before they came in and livened it up. It felt like I was under siege in my own home, and no matter how many times I reminded myself that I had the right to kick them out, I couldn't bring myself to actually do it yet, because every time I tried, my mother would cry, and those tears had been my weakness since childhood. One evening, after another exhausting day at work, I walked into the kitchen to find my mother and brother sitting there with papers spread out on the table. My heart skipped a beat when I realized what they weren't was information about transferring the house title, something my brother had apparently researched. They were discussing, in hushed but urgent voices, how it might be better for the family if the house was put under his name temporarily, since he was the man of the family and would know how to manage things. I felt the blood drain from my face. I slammed my bag down on the counter and said, "What the hell is this?" They both looked startled. Then my brother smirked and said, "Relax, we're just talking about options. You're single, you don't have responsibilities like we do. It's only fair that someone who has a family takes charge of the house. Think of it as securing the future." My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes pleading as if she thought this was logical. That was the moment the simmering anger inside me turned into fire. I shouted, "This is not your house. This is not your decision. I worked for this. I paid for this, and no one is taking it from me." My voice cracked, but it carried years of suppressed rage, years of being overshadowed, years of being told I was less important. The argument that followed shook the walls. My brother accused me of being paranoid and ungrateful. My mother accused me of being heartless and disrespectful, and his wife sat there smirking, clearly enjoying the chaos because it fed into her belief that I was weak. But I wasn't weak, not anymore. I told them point blank that if they didn't start looking for another place, I would change the locks. My brother laughed, like I was bluffing, but I wasn't. For the first time, I wasn't. That night, I sat in my room, my hands trembling, my face streaked with tears, but my heart felt steadier than it ever had before. I realized that protecting my home wasn't just about walls and a roof, it was about protecting myself, my independence, my dignity, and I knew I was ready to fight for it, no matter how ugly it got. But ugly doesn't even begin to describe what happened next. Instead of backing down, my family doubled down. My mother started ignoring me completely, treating me like I didn't exist unless she wanted something. My brother began inviting more of his friends over, almost as if to prove he controlled the space, and his wife started rearranging furniture again, telling the kids to call my house their new home. It was suffocating, unbearable, and every day I wondered how long I could last. Yet, despite the chaos, a strange clarity started forming in my mind. I realized that no matter how much they screamed, no matter how many relatives they rallied against me, this was a fight I had to finish. Because if I gave in now, I'd never get my life back. Not just my house, but my freedom, my sense of self. So, with a mix of fear and determination, I began planning exactly how I would end this takeover once and for all. Planning to take my house back wasn't easy, because it wasn't just about logistics, it was about courage. For weeks, I had been biting my tongue, swallowing my anger, but now it was time to take action. The first step I took was reaching out quietly to a lawyer friend, someone I trusted enough to explain my situation without judgment. She listened patiently as I unloaded the entire nightmare onto her: how they had moved in without consent, how they were trying to manipulate me into transferring the title, how my mother was guilt-tripping me, and my brother was acting like the king of a castle that wasn't his. She didn't sugarcoat her response. "You have every right to kick them out," she said firmly. "It's trespassing at this point. You can call the authorities if you want, and no one can force you to give up ownership, but be prepared, it won't be pretty. They'll make you out to be the villain, and you'll have to live with that." Her words echoed in my mind because I already knew I was being painted as the villain. What I had to decide was whether I could live with being misunderstood in order to finally live in peace. The next few days, I started documenting everything. Every time my brother shouted at me, every time his wife broke something, every time my mom accused me of cruelty, wrote it all down. I took photos of damages, I saved receipts, I even recorded a few of their arguments when they tried to corner me. It felt sneaky, but I knew I needed evidence in case this turned into something bigger. Meanwhile, I started subtly changing things in the house. I took my important documents to work and kept them locked there. I moved my valuables into a safe deposit box. I even began slowly packing away some of my personal items so that if things escalated, I wouldn't lose the things that mattered most. Every night, lying in bed with the sound of cartoons blasting in the living room or my brother laughing with his friends, I would whisper to myself, "This is temporary. You will get your house back. Stay strong." But of course, my family sensed something was shifting. My mother began watching me more closely, asking suspicious questions about where I was going and why I was bringing bags to the car. My brother started making snide comments like, "Don't forget, we're family. You can't just throw us out." His wife mocked me more openly, saying things like, "She acts like a landlord, but deep down she knows she can't survive without us." Those words stung because they were built on years of my family undermining me, making me believe I was weaker, smaller, less capable than I truly was. But now, each insult felt like fuel for my determination. The more they pushed, the more I realized I couldn't allow them to win. The breaking point, the absolute moment where I knew I couldn't endure another day, came on a Saturday morning. I woke up early, craving a few quiet minutes with coffee before the chaos began. But when I walked into the kitchen, I found my mother, brother, and his wife sitting there, as if in a council meeting. My brother looked up at me with a smug grin and said, "We've been talking. We've decided it's best if we just stay here until we can afford a new place. Could be a year, maybe 2. That way the kids have stability." I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest so loudly I could barely hear. My mom chimed in, "Yes, dear, it's better this way. You have enough space, and we're family. You'll adjust." I almost laughed, not out of amusement but out of sheer disbelief. Adjust. In my own home. After months of being treated like a stranger. It was too much. I set my coffee mug down, looked each of them in the eye, and said, with a steadiness that surprised even me, "No, you won't stay another year. You won't stay another month. You need to leave, this week." The explosion was immediate. My mother burst into tears, clutching her chest as if I had stabbed her. My brother jumped to his feet, shouting about how ungrateful I was, how heartless, how I had no idea what it meant to be part of a family. His wife sat back with a smirk, clearly enjoying the drama, but also adding fuel by whispering loudly, "See, I told you she doesn't care about you. She only cares about herself." I stood there, trembling but unshaken, repeating, "You need to leave. I'm done." My mother wailed, "Where do we sleep?" Again, louder than ever, her voice echoing through the house. But this time, unlike the first time, I didn't flinch, I didn't back down. I said, "That's for you to figure out. You're adults. You've made your choices. It's not my responsibility to fix them." The days that followed were the ugliest yet. My mom stopped talking to me completely, walking past me as if I didn't exist. My brother became aggressive, slamming doors, blasting music at night, trying to intimidate me into backing off. His wife deliberately left messes everywhere, making sure I knew she wasn't going to make this easy. The house became a war zone, each room filled with tension, every interaction dripping with hostility. But I refused to give in. I had already contacted my lawyer friend again, and this time, I asked her to prepare the paperwork for an official eviction notice. Just seeing the documents in my hand gave me strength. It was proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't powerless, that I wasn't trapped. When the day finally came for me to serve the notice, my hands were shaking, but my resolve was solid. I walked into the living room, where they were sprawled on the couch, handed the papers to my brother, and said, "You have 30 days, then I'm changing the locks." His face went red, my mother gasped as though I had slapped her, and his wife laughed like it was some kind of joke. But I didn't wait for their reaction. I walked back to my room, closed the door, and leaned against it, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I had control again. For the first time, I believe, I could actually reclaim my home. Serving that eviction notice was like lighting a fuse. The entire atmosphere of the house changed instantly, like I had declared war. My brother stormed around the place, muttering curses under his breath, slamming cabinets, slamming doors, even stomping up the stairs just to make his anger known. His wife became sharper with her words, openly mocking me whenever I walked by, muttering things like, "Oh look, here comes the big boss of the house," or "Careful, don't upset Her Majesty, she might call her lawyer again." My mother, she broke my heart the most, because instead of trying to understand me, instead of even attempting to mediate, she chose side, and, of course, it wasn't mine. She spent hours in her room crying loudly enough so I could hear, and when she did speak to me, it was only to say things like, "You'll regret this when I'm gone," or, "No mother should ever have to beg her own daughter for a place to stay." I wanted to scream back, "You're not boffin, you're demanding," but I bit my tongue, because I knew anything I said would just be twisted and used against me later. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, like I was fighting a battle, on all fronts with them, with my extended family, with the guilt gnawing inside me, and even with myself. The 30-day countdown began, and I marked it on my calendar like a lifeline. Each day I crossed off felt like a small victory, but also carried the dread of what would come when the deadline arrived. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want things to get that ugly. But I had prepared myself mentally for it, because I knew my brother well enough to know he wasn't going to leave quietly, and I was right. Instead of making plans to move out, he doubled down, acting as if the notice meant nothing. He brought in more of his things, filling the garage with boxes I had never seen before. He told his kids to get comfortable because they weren't going anywhere. He even joked to his friends that my sister thinks she can kick us out, but she caved. She always caves. Those words lit a fire in me, because for so long that had been true. I always caved, always gave up my spot, my peace, my needs, but not this time. I kept telling myself, "You will not cave, not again." The days dragged on, each one more unbearable than the last. I stopped inviting anyone over because the shame was too heavy. My coworkers noticed I was more withdrawn, and when a friend asked if I wanted to hang out, I lied and said I was busy because I couldn't bring myself to admit what was happening. My sanctuary had turned into a battlefield, and I didn't want anyone to see me losing it. At night, I would sit in my car outside the house for an hour before going in, just to gather the strength to face whatever chaos waited inside. Sometimes, I would cry there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, whispering to myself, "Just a few more days, just hold on." It was survival mode, plain and simple. One night, 2 weeks before the deadline, things came to a head. I walked into the house late from work and found my living room full of people, my brother's friends, drinking and laughing, the smell of alcohol heavy in the air. Empty cans littered my coffee table, greasy pizza boxes sat open, and my rug was stained with something red. My heart sank. I shouted, "What is this?" And my brother, clearly drunk, waved me off, saying, "Relax, we're just having a little fun. This is our home too. You know, our home." Those 2 words set me off like nothing else. I yelled, my voice shaking with fury, "No, it is not your home. It's mine, and you're not even supposed to be here anymore." His friends went quiet, the laughter dying in the room, but my brother stood up, towering over me, his face twisted in anger. "You're pathetic," he spat. "Always thinking you're better than everyone. You wouldn't even survive without us. You're just lonely and bitter, and that's why you want us gone." His words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they were the very insecurities I had battled for years. But instead of crumbling, I stood taller and said, "Get out. All of you, now." That night ended with me locking myself in my room, shaking with rage and fear, while they continued their party outside until dawn. I barely slept, but something in me shifted. The fear was still there, but now it was laced with steel. I knew I couldn't wait for the 30 days to be over. I had to be ready to take action the very second the deadline hit. So I began preparing more seriously. I contacted a locksmith, arranged with my lawyer friend to be on standby, and even told a couple of close friends what was happening, asking them to be there for moral support when the day came. Saying the words out loud, telling someone the truth made me feel lighter, even though the situation was still heavy. The deadline finally arrived. That morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach, but also a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I walked into the kitchen, where my mother sat silently with her tea. my brother scrolling on his phone, and his wife glaring at me. The tension was so thick it felt like I could choke on it. I said, calmly but firmly, "Today's the day. I want you all out." My mother scoffed, my brother laughed, and his wife muttered something under her breath about me being insane. But I didn't back down. I reminded them of the eviction notice, reminded them of the 30 days, reminded them that if they didn't leave, the next step would be authorities. The argument that followed was one of the worst yet. Voices raised, insults thrown, my mother crying so loudly the neighbors probably heard, my brother shouted until his face turned red, veins popping on his neck, accusing me of betraying the family. His wife threw one of my plates on the floor, shattering it, yelling that I was a witch. But through all the chaos, I stood still, my voice steady, repeating like a mantra, "You need to leave." When they realized I wasn't bluffing this time, that I wasn't going to cave like I always did, the mood shifted. My brother stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. His wife muttered curses as she started packing angrily, and my mother sat frozen, staring at me with a look of betrayal I'll never forget. "You'll regret this," she whispered, her voice trembling with both rage and sorrow. But I didn't respond. I simply turned away, because I knew if I looked her in the eye, I might crumble. That day, piece by piece, they began to pack their things. The house was filled with the sound of boxes being shoved around, bags being zipped, and the occasional muttered insult. I stayed mostly in my room, not because I was afraid anymore, but because I wanted them gone as quickly as possible without another fight. By evening, the house that had been hijacked for months finally began to feel like mine again. The noise of children, the chaos of clutter, the constant tension, it started to disappear with every box they carried out. I stood in the hallway, exhausted, drained, but also filled with an unfamiliar sense of triumph. For the first time in my life, I hadn't caved, I hadn't bent, I had stood up for myself, even when it meant being hated, even when it meant being the villain. And as I watched the last of their things disappear out the front door, I whispered to myself, "This is my home, and no one will take it from me again." The breaking point came one late evening, when I returned home from work, my mind already exhausted from the long day, only to find my brother lounging on the couch with his shoes on the cushions, his kids' toys scattered all across the hallway, and my mom in the kitchen, barking orders at me as though I was some outsider who had just stepped into their home. She yelled at me to set the table because the family is hungry, and my brother smirked like he had conquered my house completely, while his wife scrolled on her phone without lifting a finger to help. I felt an anger boil inside me that I could no longer contain, but instead of shouting immediately, I went upstairs and stood in my own bedroom, looking at my things pushed to one side, some drawers open because someone had clearly been snooping, and I realized that if I didn't reclaim my home now, I would lose it forever. When I came back downstairs, my mother asked why I looked upset. And when I told her calmly that I couldn't live like this anymore, and that they all needed to start planning to move into their own place, she erupted into tears, throwing her apron to the floor and screaming, "Where do we sleep then? Where do we go? Are you trying to make your family homeless?" Her voice was shrill, filled with accusations, and my brother quickly jumped in, acting like the victim, saying he had nowhere else to take his kids. But in truth he had options, he simply didn't want to take responsibility. I reminded them that they had stayed with me for weeks, that I had given them every chance, but now it had to end, because my peace, my privacy, and my mental health were crumbling. Instead of listening, they twisted my words, accusing me of being selfish and heartless, while I stood there trembling, yet determined. I told them I would help them with rent for the first month somewhere else, that I would even drive them to see apartments, but my home was no longer theirs to claim. The arguments stretched deep into the night, voices rising, neighbors probably hearing, my mother clutching her chest as if my words had stabbed her, and my brother pacing with fury. It was ugly, messy, and heartbreaking, but I refused to back down. For once, I chose myself, my future, and my right to live in my own space without being overrun. That night I locked my bedroom door, sat on my bed shaking, and felt both guilt and relief wash over me. Guilt, because I knew they would see me as the villain, but relief because for the first time I had spoken up firmly. I didn't sleep much, but I knew I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and from that point forward, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. I still remember the exact moment when I realized that everything had changed forever, not just in my family dynamic, but inside of me as a person, Because once you make a stand like that, once you refuse to be walked over in your own home, you cannot go back to who you were before. And even though it hurt me deeply to see the tears in my mother's eyes, to hear the anger in her voice when she screamed those words, "Where do we sleep?" I also knew with every fiber of my being that what I had done was right, and that protecting my boundaries, my sanity, and my home was something no one else could do for me. Because as much as we love our families, as much as we want to give and sacrifice and bend ourselves until there's nothing left, there comes a time when enough is enough, and I had reached that time. So while the silence in the house afterwards was almost unbearable, while my phone buzzed with messages from relatives who called me heartless, ungrateful, and selfish, I sat in my kitchen late that night with a cup of tea in my hands, staring at the ceiling and wondering if peace would ever return to my life. And I felt both heavy and light at the same time, heavy with guilt but light with relief, because my home was still mine, my rules still mattered, and no one had taken away the one sanctuary I had built for myself after years of struggle and sacrifice. And in the weeks that followed, as my mother avoided me, as my brother's wife posted passive-aggressive comments on social media, as cousins whispered about me behind my back, I walked around with my head held high, not out of arrogance, but out of survival, knowing that I had to hold my ground even if it meant being the villain in everyone else's story, because the truth was, they wanted me to break so they could mold me into the obedient daughter and sister who always put herself last. But I refused, and in that refusal, I finally found my voice. And it was loud enough to silence the guilt that had lived in me for years. So when I think back now, when I replay those screams, those accusations, those desperate eyes that looked at me like I had betrayed them, I realize I didn't betray anyone, I simply chose myself for once. And in that choice, I finally started to live the life I had always deserved, free from manipulation, free from endless giving, and free from the fear that love could only exist if I allowed myself to be trampled on. Because real love, the kind I wanted to build, in my life, with my friends, with my future, and with the family I hoped to have one day, had to come from a place of respect. And if they couldn't give me that, then their approval was never worth having in the first place.